The biggest fear parents have when taking on full-time travel is making sure their kids don't fall behind with their education. So how do you keep those little brains learning outside of the traditional schooling system? Today I'm going to run you through what's working for our kids right now and how to find out what works for your family. Let's get into it. So one of the biggest concerns we had before we left is the fact that we're not teachers. My wife and I were not teachers, and we were genuinely concerned we weren't going to be doing a good enough job to educate our kids. I didn't want to be one of these parents that did a trip like this with good intentions just to put their kids behind when they go back to school, because we always wanted to put our kids back into school after this trip finished. I've met families that unschool and world school and homeschool. Some of these kids struggle to write, some of them struggle to read, because a lot of it requires parents that are really willing, capable, and able to do the education side of it, and kids that are willing and capable of self-directed learning. So before we left, I did a heap of research on all the different types of education, philosophies, systems, curriculums out there. It's probably where I spent the most amount of time when I was doing my research, and it's probably the reason you're watching this video, is you don't want to be the parent responsible for wrecking your kid's future. So let's talk specifically about what we do as a family with our schooling. Now, this isn't going to apply to everyone. Everyone's situations are different. Our boys are 7 and 8 years old, and my wife does most of the schooling these days. At the start, it was both of us, but we found that we varied too much in the way we educate, so we really decided that they need to have one direction and one direction only, which is my wife. What we did at the very start of our trip is we tried to replicate traditional schooling, which was a mistake, and you really don't want to do that. The thing is, with traveling full-time or traveling for an extended period, and you're only educating 2 children, it's not like normal schooling because the logistics are completely different. We're traveling often, we're moving around a lot. Sometimes you rock up to a place and doesn't even have a desk. So you've got to be able to adapt to the situation you're in, whereas a classroom doesn't have that. A classroom has the desk in the same spot, there's a whiteboard there, there's information, it's subtle things like you can't just go and get something printed when you're traveling on the road. It's quite an effort to go and get something printed. And you have to change your mindset on what schooling is. When you're trying to educate 1, 2, 3 kids and that's it, you can actually compress a lot of the time it takes to do school into like a 2-3 hour period. And most families that we meet on the road, and ourselves included, only do 2 or 3 hours of education a day. So for us, that's 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. And while most troubled families agree it only takes a couple of hours a day to get your kids a solid education, where it differs a lot is the modality that people use to actually educate. The space is full of different types of education. So there is unschooling, which is effectively where you do self-directed learning and the kids decide what they want to learn based on their own interests. Then you have things like world schooling, which is where it's self-directed learning, but you as a parent help curate the experience by using the world to educate them. So that would be things like letting them handle money. When you go to a place, you sort of curate the learning and get them genuinely interested in what you're doing. So you let the world teach your kids, as opposed to unschooling where they just focus on the interests that they have and they decide what they want to learn. Then you have everything in between that, and then you have traditional schooling on one side. So if you had unschooling on one side, you have traditional schooling on the other side. That's the spectrum. So what we do as parents and what we found works the best for us is we do this hybrid. So we do English and maths in a traditional schooling type of situation. So we focus on English and maths. We follow the Australian curriculum, which you can get off the Australian government website. It tells you the learning outcomes that kids require. Then we actually build a structured English and math lesson around that every day. So in traditional schooling, they may do English and maths 2 to 3 times a week. We do English and math 5 times a week, but we don't worry about geography, history, social studies, all the extracurricular stuff, because we believe that the world can teach them more about that stuff than sitting in a classroom. Going to the landmark itself and learning about it and touching and feeling what you're talking about in the classroom is way better than just sitting in a classroom and looking on a screen and learning about it. So we take the best of both worlds, I believe, which is the world schooling and touching and feeling and really learning the ins and outs of what you're actually looking at in the world, and incorporate that into English and math. And we also shandy in practical world experience math and English. So the boys handle money, they do map directions, they're learning a second language. Every time they go to a new country, we basically curate that experience and go, okay, let's learn what hello, goodbye, thank you, just the basics of the languages. I want to reiterate that there's no right way of doing this. There's plenty of parents that have very intelligent, successful, and driven children that unschool. And there's a lot of parents out there that have very successful, driven children that are doing traditional schooling just online. Everything in between works. It just comes down to you as a parent and whether you really care about the education your children's getting or not. So let's talk a little bit about world schooling for a sec, because I know world schooling gets thrown around a lot, but there are things you can do as parents to amplify the message and amplify the learning without the kids feel like they're learning things. So something that we do when we go to different places, so let's say for instance, we're in Vietnam at the moment, and one of the first things we did in the first dinner we had is put on a video about Vietnam and its history. So I was genuinely curious about that. And I believe it helps all of us get a better experience in the country that we're visiting. And the unique educational opportunity that traveling full-time or traveling for an extended period gives you is to get them excited about the things that they could potentially learn when you go and visit something. So what we found with our kids is they're really keen to go to adventure parks and theme parks and play places, but going to a temple, which is what we want to see, they're like, no, Dad, I don't really care about this temple. So one way we got them really excited about that is showing them the potential learning opportunities when we get there. So we need to learn about the history of it. Or we're going to this place, we're going to a water park. Let's learn how water slides actually work. How do they get the water from the bottom of the park to the top of the park? Those are the kinds of questions now we ask our children. Then when we get home, we just Google stuff. And as long as a parent, you have an active interest and you actually care about your children learning things, then they're gonna be okay. Why do you think the clownfish is an anemone over there?
Because
Yeah, so it's there to protect them, right? So another tip I would give you is what we like to do before we head out to an adventure or we go and visit somewhere is we'll just watch documentaries or travel vlogs or videos on things to give us context on the kind of questions to ask, and give the kids some context on what they're going to visit and the lens they should be looking at it from. So one of the biggest mistakes that we had to learn the hard way, as I mentioned earlier, is trying to treat it as traditional schooling. One of the key benefits of traveling like this, and what you won't be able to do if you do a traditional classroom setting, is you can actually tailor what you're teaching to your children to the strengths and the weakness of your kids. So for instance, Liam absolutely excelled at math. So he's doing maths that's a year ahead now because he just loves math and he's just really excelling forward. And what we do as a parent that's teaching him is we just go, yep, he's doing really well. We're just going to continue to feed him more math, more complex maths. And next thing, he's a year ahead in math. Riley, on the other hand, we only found this out when we pulled him out of school. He was actually really far behind where the state government said he needed to be in their own words. So we slowed down a lot for Riley. We made sure that he caught up to where he needed to be. So we went back to some of the fundamentals. So went back to some year one stuff and just reiterated fundamentals. And then we built on that, and now he's caught up and he's accelerated. Things like tutoring, games, videos, we incorporate all of that into the way we teach our children. So it's not all just sitting there reading out of a book and rote learning. We sometimes put on math games and English games. Sometimes we got things like Prodigy and Reading Eggs to help with that. We find flash games on the internet that help with math and English. In areas that we struggle specifically to teach, where we maybe aren't getting across what we want to get across, we'll get tutors in to help. So Riley has an English tutor that helps every now and again. We got someone to help them with cursive writing because we both suck at writing neatly. And we also do little extracurricular stuff. Like boys also have a Minecraft Redstone class that they do once a week to learn how to use Redstone in Minecraft because that's their genuine interest. We put that into the curriculum so they'll learn about Redstone, and then we'll try and make English lessons and math lessons around Minecraft. So you're probably sitting there and going, oh, Jimmy, that sounds really good and it sounds like what we want to do, but how did you get from not knowing how to educate your children to being in a position where you're comfortable to do it? And that's a great question. And I think the specific mechanics on how to do it deserve their own video. But in this video, I'm going to clarify what is actually required to teach your children, because I think that will help a lot. There's a lot of resources online available to be able to teach your children online, because quite frankly, a lot of schools had to do it. So they developed a lot of resources quickly, which you can take advantage of as a parent that's teaching your own child. The thing I had to get my head around for it to really click was the fact that learning outcomes and curriculum are completely different things. So every schooling system has learning outcomes. So they basically have a list of things that your child needs to be able to do for the year that you're trying to teach them. So if it's year 3, the teachers get given learning outcomes, and then the teachers, and why teachers should be paid way more than they are, sit down and build a curriculum around the learning outcomes. So on the learning outcome, it might say they need to be able to do fractions, right? So the teacher will go and find learning resources to teach it in the way they want to teach. So they might go onto a site like Twinkle, which is a bunch of teacher resources, and go, okay, this is a fractions worksheet. I'm going to incorporate that into my system. So that becomes the curriculum. And basically what you need to do as a parent is work out the learning outcomes, assess where your child is relative to those learning outcomes, and then all you do is you either buy or build a curriculum based around that. So what we do specifically is Pauline checks the learning outcomes, what they need to achieve for the month that we're in, and then she goes into Twinkle and finds resources that are available to be able to teach that. So if it's fractions, she'll go in there and go, okay, there's 1,000 different ways to teach fractions. The boys are into sharks and underwater. We'll do it around sharks and underwater. Go and find that, and then we put it into a thing called Seesaw, which allows us to write into our worksheets without having to print them out, which was a life hack that we really needed to find out. And then we go and teach and rinse and repeat. We just do that for all of the learning outcomes. That way we know when the kids enter the next year, they're going to have done all the learning outcomes they need to be able to move on to the next year. Now, this is specific to like a traditional schooling. World schooling and unschooling are completely different. There's also fully online curriculums that don't involve the parents at all. So these are like digital schools, and they basically have teachers that will actually teach your children and remove you from that requirement. Now, they're expensive, but the beauty about that is if you have to work during the day, if you have a remote job, it allows you to be removed from the process, and it allows the teacher to act as the teacher and you to act as the parent. Now, there's also one in the middle, which is like an online, fully online school that is self-directed. So there's no teacher, you're expected to still be the teacher, but it's done fully online. So the curriculum is there, it's all already planned out, and the kids just log in, they select what they have to do for the day, and they start to do it. So this is things like Me Academy and Yuka School and things like that. It really requires a kid to be self-driven and be able to teach themselves things. Now that I've given you a lay of the land of the world schooling, homeschooling, unschooling spectrum, you're now probably wondering what kind of specific education should I be giving my children? And it really comes down to what your long-term plans are for your kids and whether you want them to enter higher education or not. So the thing with us, and the reason we chose this hybrid model between world schooling and traditional English and math, is that we're not going to be traveling like this forever. Our plan is to basically enter the kids back into the traditional schooling system a year before high school. So that gives us about 3 years of traveling. And because we're not doing this forever, we need to be conscious that these kids are going to be re-entering the school system, and we don't want to disadvantage them from an English and math perspective. The other stuff they can learn, if they've missed things in science, we can pick that up quickly with tutors and things like that, because it's only a subject that's done once a week. But if they struggle with English and math and they get into a class and they haven't done algebra, say for instance, they're going to really struggle to catch up, especially with the way the schooling system is designed. So fundamentally, the way you educate your children is unique to your specific circumstances. It's not as scary as it seems. Like I said, when we first started traveling, it was one thing I was worried about more than anything else. But once we got into it and got into the flow, we found that it wasn't as bad as we've made it out in our head, and that as a parent, you just work out a way to do it, because at the end of the day, you really care about your children. You want to make sure that they get every chance in life as possible. But here's the thing, with family travel, there's much more than just education. So you need to watch my video here on the truth of full-time family travel to hear more about what's failed and succeeded for our family. Stay safe, guys, and good luck in your educational journey.